Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Books and Coffee presentation. I'm Emma Oxford, Director of Community Relations, and a special welcome to members of the Friends of Concordia. We really value your support, and please watch out in the mail next month for our annual membership drive. We hope that you will refresh your membership or join for the first time if you haven't been a member up till now. We really do count on your support for all our wonderful programming and also to help provide many opportunities for our students here on campus. I think most of you have filled out a green raffle card at the entrance. If you haven't done that, raise your hand in a minute and we'll bring one round to you. Tonight, our prize is a signed copy of the book we're discussing, Black Hearts. And I'm thrilled to welcome its author to Concordia this evening. Jim Frederick took a year, maybe more, away from weekly journalism, 2 years away from weekly journalism to research and write Black Hearts. The result is a truly riveting read. When I first picked up a copy, I couldn't put it down. It's a tough read, a harrowing account, but he really does give a most realistic picture of what it's like to serve in the US Army in Iraq at the height of the conflict there. It's also really about leadership under stress, and I think the book is really being appreciated for what it tells us about that. The New York Times recent review described it as a narrative that combines elements of In Cold Blood and Black Hawk Down with a touch of Apocalypse Now as it builds towards its terrible climax. After finishing Black Hearts, Jim Frederick returned to Time magazine and recently became assistant managing editor based here in New York. Previously, he had extensive experience as an editor and a correspondent in London and Tokyo. Before he joined Time, he was a senior editor at Money magazine in New York. His first book, which he co-authored with former U.S. Army Sergeant Charles Jenkins, is called The Reluctant Communist, My Desertion, Court-Martial, and 40 Years Imprisonment in North Korea. And that one's quite a story, too. Jim hails from Illinois. He holds a BA from Columbia University and an MBA from New York University's Stern School of Business. I'm very pleased to welcome him to Concordia with his fiancée, fellow journalist, Charlotte Greensit. After Jim's remarks, he'll take some questions, and please keep your questions brief and use the microphone that we'll hand around the audience. We will. Thank you very much, Jim, for taking the time to be with us here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you for all of you coming on a beautiful, almost summer evening. So it means a lot to me to be invited here. It means a lot to me to be able to speak to you, and thanks very much for coming. I'm going to start with a little background about the book. Hopefully, for those of you who have read it, I won't cover too much ground, but I think a little background is necessary to get to some of the new material that I prepared just to speak to you about leadership in general. It's information about how the book came to be and why a Tokyo bureau chief wound up writing a book about a war crime in Iraq. As you can probably tell from the subtitle, One Platoon's Descent into Madness in Iraq's Triangle of Death, my book it's a rather brutal examination of a tough and difficult subject to look at. It's the story of a one-year deployment of a company of men, specifically Bravo Company, 1st Platoon, 502nd Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division, to a region of Iraq known as the Triangle of Death, which is a 330 square mile region just south of Baghdad that was arguably in 2005 and 2006 the country's most dangerous place at its most dangerous time. This company, Bravo Company, came to my notice when I was a Tokyo bureau chief at Time. It was June 2006, and the war was unequivocally going very badly for the United States. There was no question at that time now, especially in retrospect, that we were losing the war. The news was bad and unrelenting, but one item that summer in particular caught my eye as I was working in Tokyo. 3 troopers from Bravo Company, 1st of the 502nd, 101st Airborne Division, were overrun at a remote checkpoint, a town south of Baghdad called Mahmudiyah. One soldier was found dead on the scene, and 2 were missing, presumed taken hostage. I watched TV and internet updates every day for news about their fate, and they were found 3 days later, mutilated. One had been beheaded. They had been booby-trapped with explosive devices, and their bodies had been burned and otherwise desecrated. About 2 weeks after that, another massive story broke out of Iraq. It was, in many senses, for the perpetrators of an unthinkable desecration, it was even worse than what had happened before, because this had been committed by four of our own. 4 United States soldiers were accused of raping a 14-year-old Iraqi girl, killing her parents, and her 6-year-old sister. It took a while for me to piece together that the soldiers who had been abducted were not just from the same company, but from the very same platoon, and an infantry platoon is about 35 people, and I just did a quick head count, and that's not many more people that are in this room. So imagine a U.S. Army unit that's about this big, and seven of you were involved in one way or another with 2 of the most notorious events to happen during the Iraq War up till that period. It took me a while to piece this together, but after I did so, whether by fate or otherwise, I got a phone call from an Army lawyer. He was the same Army lawyer that I got to know covering the case of Charles Robert Jenkins. He was Charles Robert Jenkins' defense lawyer in the United States Army, and I'd gotten to know him in 2004, and we had kept in touch since then. He called me from Baghdad. He called me from, Baghdad to Tokyo, so he probably could have used one of those calling cards that you sell. And he asked me if I'd been following these events that were in the news, what had happened to Bravo Company, and I said that I had, and he told me that he had been assigned to defend one of the 4 soldiers that was accused of this rape murder. And he didn't want to get into any of the specifics of his client's case whatsoever. But as a U.S. soldier he's a captain, but as a captain in the U.S. Army, he was so horrified by what was going on in Bravo Company down in the Triangle of Death that, I'll never forget what he said that day. He said, go down and you need to look at what's happening to Bravo Company, if not for the sake of my client, then for the sake of the other guys in Bravo. What's going on down there would turn your hair white. I was intrigued by what this Army lawyer told me, and I started researching the deployment. I tracked the trials of the accused soldiers as they slowly went to court over the next 3 years. I contacted the men of 1st Platoon after they had come back from their deployment in late 2006 to see if they were willing to talk to me. Surprisingly, to me anyway, they were. It turns out they were rather despondent that the world was judging them for the actions of 4 criminals in their midst, and they were eager to tell their story about the context of what was actually going down there. Soon after I started researching this story in earnest, however, I was forced to confront what sort of story exactly I was dealing with. I didn't really know. Was this really just a true crime story that happened to happen in some far-off land? Was there more to it? The stories that the soldiers were telling me were riveting and harrowing. They described to me the devastating losses that they had suffered in this platoon, which is not more than the people in this room. They had 7 dead in their platoon alone. They told me about the devastatingly effective terror instrument that is now known as the IED, or the improvised explosive device, that someone in their battalion encountered on an average of 3 times a day. Their deployment lasted roughly 330 days, and in their area of operations, they found or got blown up by 900 IEDs. So 3 times a day, they were getting blown up. These soldiers suggested to me that this was really not ultimately a crime story at all. There was something more to this, and they suggested that I get in touch with 2nd Platoon and 3rd Platoon from Bravo Company because I couldn't understand what 1st Platoon went through if I didn't understand what 2nd and 3rd Platoon had gone through, because 2nd and 3rd Platoon had come through the exact same deployment, the exact same suffering, the exact same deprivation with a much higher degree of esprit de corps, sense of brotherhood and accomplishment than 1st Platoon had. So I followed their advice. I interviewed more soldiers from all of Bravo Company. I traveled to 1st Battalion's old area of operations in the Triangle of Death. I spoke to as many Iraqi locals as I could. I interviewed the immediate family of the murdered Iraqi family. The soldiers that I talked to put me in touch with more soldiers. I interviewed scores more servicemen. I wound up focusing on not just all of Bravo, but all of 1st Battalion, and a battalion is about 700 men. It's about 5 or 6 companies. The further my research took me, though, the more I realized that the essence of this platoon story and this company's story and this battalion's story was that it was not a true crime story. It was actually a leadership story. I was very reluctant to accept this realization. Because there are few professions in the world that know more about leadership than journalists. We know almost nothing about leadership. Most journalists go into the business because they are suspicious of authority. We are suspicious of power in general. Journalism attracts people who hate being led and hate being leaders. And then, only then, after we've been in the business of journalism for a while and we realize that we're old enough and we've risen to a power high enough that magazines, newspapers, and websites are actually businesses, and we have to run those, and we have to lead those, and we usually make a mess of those too. So I did not really want to have this be a leadership story, but again and again it kept hitting me in the face. The story kept saying, this is unavoidable, this is what the book is all about. So reluctantly and finally I began to embrace it, and I turned the book overall into a study of leadership, a study of leadership under the extreme stresses of combat. And the more I dug into the facts, and the more I became convinced that despite senior leadership of this battalion's insistence that they practiced what they incessantly referred to as engaged leadership, that the facts demonstrated that they were actually woefully out of touch with the realities on the ground for 1st Platoon. This battalion's leadership was either unwilling or unable to recognize how depleted and combat ineffective 1st Platoon had become within really its first 3 months of a 12-month deployment. Instead, they belittled 1st Platoon's incapacity. They told them that they were wallowing in their self-pity, and they blamed them for their platoon-level leadership for all of their problems, which in turn exacerbated 1st Platoon's feelings of isolation, persecution, and contributed to the platoon's downward spiral. Black Hearts also became a book about leadership because there's no other way that I could find to explain the horrible outcomes when everybody had the best of intentions. Except for the 4 men who committed this crime, I don't believe that anyone in this unit, all the way up to brigade and battalion leadership, was a bad person. I believe that every last person in this unit was trying to do his best, and because it was an infantry battalion, everybody in the platoon was a man. They were making decisions on the fly and under fire in unspeakably difficult and dangerous circumstances. But the difference between intentions and outcomes then could only be attributed to leadership, efficiency, and effectiveness. So for 2 years of writing this book, for me, became a research project in leadership. So what did I learn? Well, I'm going to share with you 6 rules of leadership, but unlike most seminars you may have attended, these are 6 lessons in bad leadership. So how to become a terrible leader in 6 easy steps. Number 1 is a particularly crucial one. Good leaders know that they're good leaders. But, and this is where the danger lurks, bad leaders know. Bad leaders are absolutely certain that they are good leaders too. And that's where the danger lays. There's no doubt that this deployment was difficult and dangerous, but I think that the facts of the book demonstrate that bad leadership actually made a bad situation worse. That said, I'm certain that I did not meet a single soldier or officer from that deployment who told me I was bad at my job. I am not a good leader. I think this book makes a fairly persuasive case that there were some very good leaders in Bravo Company and 1st Battalion, but that there were also very many poor ones. And many of those, even when I was interviewing them, had very high opinions of themselves and their leadership capabilities. It's a corollary to lesson 1. People's capacity for self-deception is bottomless. And most people, all evidence to the contrary, will work to take refuge in some corner of rationalization that they can believe that they too are a good leader. Lesson number 2. Bad leaders push blame downwards. Because bad leaders think they are good leaders, when bad things happen, they frequently cannot conceive of anything bad having to do with them, or they being the cause of anything bad that has happened. There is a source in my book, a young man by the name of Sergeant John Diem. Sergeant John Diem is probably one of the most insightful and thoughtful and smartest men that I have ever met. He described for me an episode when, after the rape murder had come out, a senior officer ripped into 1st Platoon, and as was common for the senior leadership in this unit, he blamed 1st Platoon for all of their problems, including the fact that they had criminals in their midst. And this is what Diem told me. He said, "That was the defining emotional moment of the tour for me. If you talk to others, they will most likely say, 'We just got done with the memorial, and they were telling us,'" and I'm sorry, there's going to be some dirty words here, "how fucked up we were." And they will leave it at that. But nobody will step back and look at it like, wait a minute, maybe they had a point. Maybe they were trying to say something that was important. Maybe we, 1st Platoon, had become something monstrous. But John Diem continues. This is him again. "Now, the one thing that was absent is if they had gotten up there and they'd say, 'We failed you too. We have allowed you guys to turn into monsters. And I, the leader, have completely forsaken you when you needed the support that only I had the power to provide. But I lacked the character to do it. All of you have failed. All of us have failed. Me and we as a family, 1st Battalion, Bravo Company, 1st Platoon, all the way up and down the line, we have failed. At some point, we failed to have the character to make the right decisions so that something like this never happened. Mine was not the crowning failure. Mine was the crowning failure, but not the only one." Now, this is John Diem switching back into his own voice. If at any point that had come out of the leader's mouth, a lot of people would have snapped out of it. But nobody's got the grit to say that. Everybody wants to say, "It wasn't my fault," including him. Number 3. Bad leaders isolate subordinates who are underperforming rather than trying to bring them back into the fold. Constant contact and constant communication is key to good leadership, in my opinion. If there's one thing that keeps coming up in Black Hearts is that the overall unit, whether on a platoon level or a company level, whenever a unit begins to detach itself from the larger home unit, it is usually isolation that causes it. Bravo Company was isolated both geographically and increasingly psychologically from the rest of the battalion. They were on a forward base about 6 miles away. Communications were very poor. Travel was very poor. And their isolation began to spin on itself, and they began to think of themselves as something different from the rest of 1st Battalion. They began to underperform. But rather than understanding the problems that Bravo was having, why communications might have been so difficult, they began to blame Bravo Company, this is senior leadership, to tell them that they were, in fact, the root of their own problems. A particularly demoralizing thing to say in the modern military when the foot soldier is more reliant on the superstructure of the Army to take care of him than a child is reliant on a parent. A soldier requires the superstructure of the Army for food, for housing, for shelter, for clothing. It is a very powerless relationship. And so when senior leadership comes down on the foot soldier, it can be a very demoralizing experience. The Pygmalion effect is real, and it happened to 1st Platoon. They were told that they were losers and incompetents for so long that they began to believe this, and subconsciously and sometimes consciously they began to live up to their outcast status. So they became the black sheep that they had been told from day one that they were. Lesson number 4. Bad leaders make subordinates feel unimportant. Sergeant First Class Phil Blaisdell, who was a platoon sergeant in Bravo Company's 3rd Platoon, was, in my opinion, a large part of the reason that 3rd Platoon maintained a combat functionality and esprit de corps that 1st Platoon was not able to maintain. And a big part of his secret was the way that he brought everybody down to the lowest private into the group. He made them feel that they were a part of something big. There was something about the way that he interacted with his subordinates that he made even privates feel important, and he made them feel like they were crucial to the outcome of the operation, which is of course true, but in a power structure in any corporation, or especially the military, it's very easy to make the lower ranks feel as if they're unimportant. Phil Blaisdell did the opposite. People did what he said, not because it was an order, but because they wanted to please Phil Blaisdell. And that was the true heart of his leadership power. On the other hand, one of the most divisive figures in the book was Lieutenant Colonel Tom Kunk, who was 1st Battalion's commander. He had trouble with his own subordinates from the day he took control of the battalion. Here I'm going to quote a little bit. I tried to keep quoting from the book to the minimum, but here I'm going to quote a little bit from the book. In the book I write, Kunk treated his subordinates with a nastiness and an impatience that they had never seen before, where correction and coaching turned into shouted, expletive-laden humiliation and disparagement. Kunk's meetings became events to dread, more about him proving how little his underlings knew than in sharing information or solving problems. If subordinates didn't have a correct response at the ready, Kunk would humiliate them, assail their qualifications to hold command, and even fire off the sanctum sanctorum of accusations, doubting their concern for the welfare of their own soldiers. Kunk dripped with contempt. By Army culture, superior officers can call their subordinates by their first name. Some do so as an indication of familiarity or even affection. Kunk, with venomous emphasis he applied to each name, wielded it as a weapon of disrespect. Have you ever thought of that, Bill? Do I have to do your job for you, John? He routinely ridiculed subordinate commanders in front of their own men, and he was not above threatening ranks as low as lieutenants with violence, telling one that he would beat his fucking ass if he did not follow a recently delivered order. Now, Kunk's subordinates were not privates and privates first class. Kunk's subordinates were captains and first sergeants with between 6 and 20 years in the Army. These were men who were between the ages of 30 and 40 years old, with millions of dollars of training poured into them. And to be made to feel so worthless while in a combat environment made for much of 1st Battalion practically combat ineffective itself. Number 5. Bad leaders espouse philosophies that they do not follow. Listen to your people on the ground. Trust the people you have in place. This kind of leadership wisdom you often hear Army officers pontificate about. But even those who espouse it have a tough time following it. Routinely in my research of Black Hearts, I would hear stories of commanders who would direct minute troop movements off of video screens from video camera towers that had 20-mile ranges, almost like a video game. They would contradict the orders of leaders in the field based on things that they had heard from other commanders. They would instruct leaders in one geographic area to pursue certain tactics that were working in other geographic areas, despite the protests of the local commander who insisted that that tactic would not work in his area. One example was IED clearance techniques, that there's various different types of IEDs, and some are command detonated, which are used with a wire, and some are remote detonated, which are used by a cell phone or some other sort of electronic signaling device. It was very frequent that different bomb makers would use different types of bombs in different regions, and there would be, for example, a type of formation where soldiers would have to be strung out in a line and walk through a field with the idea of finding the command wire. Certain leaders, that's the perfect way to find IEDs. We should do that everywhere, above the objections of a company commander who would say, but we have remote detonated IEDs, and so if we walk through a field looking for a wire, we'll never find one. Now, it seems so easy, it seems so obvious in retrospect, but under the pressures of that combat environment, very often these commanders were overruled, saying, no, it's working perfect over here. These guys found 10 IEDs in 10 days. You're going to do it this way. This happened routinely. Leaders not espousing the philosophies that they pontificated about, that you listen to your people on the ground, you trust the people that you have in place. Lesson number 6. At their worst, bad leaders lie to their superiors, or, marginally better, they withhold crucial information from them. A recurring theme in Black Hearts is what leaders do when they are asked to do the impossible. It is a tension that's particularly thorny in the military. There is a culture in the military which makes the military unique in just about any human endeavor, where the accomplishment of the mission trumps absolutely everything, even the safety and welfare of a soldier. It is probably unique in human endeavors, where leaders can and do, and are expected, to order their followers to their deaths. If the preservation of troops' safety was the number one priority, any Army leader would tell you, then that's easy. We would just never leave the base. But of course, there are limits. If soldiers' safety, or what the Army calls force protection, were of zero concern, then the Army could, to this day, behave like the Japanese Army of World War II, where human wave charges, the only tactical edge that they could possibly hope to bring to bear, was that there were more bodies running at the Americans than the Americans could possibly shoot down before being overrun. This was considered a perfectly reasonable way to treat one's own soldiers. So obviously, there's no limit to the mission taking a priority. Obviously, there are limits. And Bravo Company and all of 1st Battalion was in a particularly tight spot. Bravo soldiers were constantly being asked to outperform the long-run limits of human endurance. And now, as a leader, what would you do about that? The Army is not a culture that tolerates the answer of no, or we can't do that, or we don't have enough people to do that. A commander could and should be relieved on the spot anytime he says no to a direct order. Either you do it or I will find someone who can is a perfectly appropriate response for a senior officer when being told, no, we can't do that. So now what do you do? I personally, being a civilian, I don't know. But it's one of the most troubling conflicts baked into military culture, and military theorists are going to have to solve this at some point, because when presented with the impossible and with no not being an option, it is an obvious impulse to lie. To say that everything's going okay, of course we can do that, everything is achievable, when obviously it's not achievable. In one area of this battalion's AO, or area of operations, some lower-ranked soldiers became convinced that the reporting was being changed to reflect the story that the superiors wanted to hear, not the truth. And when I say lower ranking, I actually mean the first sergeant, which is actually a very high-ranking non-commissioned officer. So it's not just like some private was thinking this, it was a guy in a position to know. I wrote in the book that this particular first sergeant asserted that not only was the troops to task math not working, how many people could be deployed for a certain mission over a given period of time and still have enough time for rest and refit and food. The battalion was playing loose with their reports to brigade. They would call 3 guys a squad, he said, but you can't turn 3 guys into 9 unless you are lying. They were bullshitting brigade. They were sending reports up saying that this checkpoint is manned with a full squad, which is what the requirement was, but the guidance says that you have to have at least a squad out there with 2 vehicles, and if you're not doing that, then you're bullshitting brigade. The same company's executive officer, which is a first lieutenant, said, there's a culture in the military of just keeping your mouth shut for some reason, of saying that you can do stuff. Sometimes you can make do with what you have, but you might not get the results you want without a better plan. But when people underneath see people who speaking truth to power getting crushed, it shows them that speaking truth to power does not necessarily pay. What that means is that the people up top start getting bad feedback. You can get reports that XYZ is fine when XYZ is not fine. In fact, XYZ is the opposite of fine. I've seen this happen, says the executive officer. I've seen reports sent from my level, and by the time they get just up to the brigade level, which is just 2 levels higher, the report that someone had given me or that I had written myself is misquoted to the board. Now, it's not that one little piece of information is going to lose the war, but when you see the cumulative effect of information becoming distorted or washed in order to tell a story that the battalion or the brigade wants to tell to his hires, then you've got real problems. That's the more sinister side of this. So in a lot of ways, that is a summation of what Black Hearts is all about. is how do military leaders tell their superiors bad news because saying no is not an option? In my opinion, the best military leaders follow orders, but they do so while also making their objections heard. The worst military leaders follow orders and not only keep their objections to themselves, they alter their reporting of reality so that the very highest echelons don't even know that there's a problem. There's an axiom, a military axiom, that goes, there are no bad regiments, only bad colonels. Now, I did not think of this phrase. It's been in circulation for some time. Some people attribute it to Napoleon. Some people attribute it to Ulysses Grant. But I think it's apt, and I think it sums up a lot of what Black Hearts is all about. Because again and again, as I was researching the book, I would ask myself, what made 1st Platoon special? What made it go so wrong? And again, I came to the conclusion that this particular collection of men was no better or worse than any other collection of men in the Army. They had a particular soldier by the name of Stephen Green who was, even before he joined the Army, was now in retrospect pretty well demonstrated to be a sociopath even before joining the Army. He was the trigger man and the ringleader of the rape murder case. But statistically, it stands to reason that there must be potential psychopaths in the Army who are never able to commit such a crime, and the things that separate those units from this one was leadership. From top down, that set the tone that allowed this unit to unravel. Most soldiers, after all, are no more than boys. And I think about all the trouble that college kids can get into with drinking, drugs, and other mayhem. Now put a rifle in their hand and subject them to the extreme stress of 330 days of combat in a foreign country where the enemy doesn't wear a uniform and everybody is a potential enemy, and you begin to realize just how crucial adult supervision really is in the Army, how important guidance is to every act of warfighting and proper soldierly behavior. It is simply impossible to overstate just how important leadership is. Leadership is everything. And that concludes my prepared remarks, so I'm happy to take questions.
So please raise your hand and we'll bring you a microphone if you would like to ask a question. We'll start right over here with David.
Yes, thank you for that presentation. I just wondered if you thought any of those insufficiencies and horrible things that happened were due to improper training or improper equipment, and that maybe they felt they were being let down. And I guess the other kind of related question is, when you went into this, how cooperative was the government in giving you information about it?
Those are great questions. The first part, I think that overall, I determined pretty early that the story of Black Hearts, the story of Bravo Company, is the tactical consequence of strategic failures. Meaning, we have heard a lot about there weren't enough boots on the ground. I was like, well, what does that mean? Well, what that means is you go out on patrol with 3 men when you're supposed to go out on patrol with 9, because the Army culture says that even though it's plainly against doctrine and it's against every field handbook that you've ever read, you can't say no when you have to go do a patrol. And so the unit that replaced Bravo Company was a battalion. So an area that was held down by 135 men, once the surge happened, was held down by 700. So it just goes to show at the time they didn't have enough men, they didn't have enough equipment. The training was, in terms of pure warfighting training, was probably adequate. In terms of counterinsurgency training, it was at that time non-existent. Counterinsurgency had really not taken hold. So there was a very muddled message about whether this unit should be hunting down and killing bad guys, or whether they should be protecting and winning the hearts and minds of the populace. Now with the surge and General Petraeus, the second part overwhelmingly became the priority, and it's now fairly clear that that was the correct strategy. Bravo Company was just following orders. At that time, the emphasis was far more on hunting down and killing bad guys. they probably killed a lot of good guys along with the bad guys, which is why the insurgency then intensifies. About the second part of your question, I got, I would say, unfettered passive support. The Army, meaning the Secretary of the Army or its press arm, became aware fairly early on that I was poking around this story. And at first they made these harumphs about, you need permission to talk to our people. Or some, it was a very tense exchange at first, during which I had to patiently explain to them that I'm a civilian and I don't answer to them and I don't have to do anything that they say, actually. And so then we kind of regrouped and we went back to each other and they said, well, what do you have in mind? And again, with not asking their permission, I said, this is what the book is about. It is as journalistic, as factual, as balanced an account of this deployment as possible. And then they came back saying, okay, that sounds great. They even wrote a letter saying that the Secretary of the Army is providing passive support, which means I could show this letter to a soldier who thought that he might get in trouble by talking to me and tell them that the Army says it's okay to talk to me. You don't actually need more specific permission, or you don't need to worry about repercussions. You don't need to worry about reprisals just for talking to me. So after 2 or 3 weeks of it being sort of tense, the Army, meaning the big Army, just kind of got out of the way. And now, in the aftermath of the book, the Army has been actually amazingly supportive. Maybe not certain leaders depicted in the book, but leadership arms of the Army, West Point, certain generals, the men of Bravo Company itself have been overwhelmingly supportive about some of the lessons that are perhaps in the book. And I think that the Army, to its great credit for all of its many faults, is actually a fairly self-critical organization, surprisingly so. And surprisingly, unlike the Vietnam War era, I think that the turnaround in Iraq is that the Army is a learning organization and is a self-correcting organization and is a self-critical organization more than at any time in its past. And that's to great credit. That alone is great credit to the Army. So.
A couple of quick factual questions. What's happened to the 4 main characters? Where's the lieutenant colonel? Where's the sociopath?
The lieutenant colonel was promoted to colonel, and he's now in a staff. He's in a he's in a staff position, a non-line position. He doesn't command soldiers in battle, but he's in a staff job in the Pentagon. The 4 who committed the crime, all 3 of them are doing terms in excess of 90 years in jail. And the 4th, Stephen Green, who's literally the trigger man on all 4 murders, is doing 5 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole.
You say that the Army was receptive, responsive. This has happened before. And your unit was 6 miles cut off from, in a sense, cut off.
Right.
IEDs going off left and right, tremendous pressure, tremendous tension. The Army's learned, but the Army's learned?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think that the Army is... Atrocities happen in every war. Atrocities have happened since the beginning of time. I actually think that our Army today is exceedingly well-behaved and exceedingly interested in a way that they might not have been in centuries or decades past of rooting out malfeasance and actually meting out severe punishment to these kinds of crimes. I could not tell you that, there's not tensions or things to be done, or that, just because of the book or just because of the lessons that, the Army is now a perfect organization where, every soldier is an angel. No, I wouldn't say that. But I would say that the upper echelons of leadership theory and trying to figure out why units go bad Those people have been very receptive in trying to use this as a case study of diagnosing, okay, as an anthropological, sociological leadership study, how did it go so wrong so quickly? Because many other units, to this day in Afghanistan, are suffering probably the same deprivations, deaths, loneliness, colds, battle horror that Bravo Company did, but we hope and pray and are fairly confident that not every one of them will end in a war crime. So I think that's what the Army is interested in, is putting units in petri dishes. Why did this one go wrong, and why did this one not?
Question over there.
Yes. I just wanted to get your opinion on whether the lessons that were learned in this particular situation in Iraq, but just generally within the war in Iraq, are now being applied in Afghanistan so that we won't see these kinds of, well, the potential may be less for these kinds of incidents to crop up there, and many of the lessons learned in the Iraq counterinsurgency will be applied in Afghanistan.
Despite everything that I've said about the Army being a learning organization, I can't say that atrocities won't happen. And I can't say that the Army is able to guarantee that they won't happen. One of the priorities I had in the book was trying to dispel the notion, the bad apples notion of that. Well, there were 4 guys who were just bad apples, and there's nothing that we could have done to prevent this crime because criminals exist in every subculture. I tried to dispel that line of excuse making because, in fact, these soldiers were malingering, badly behaved soldiers who were sending red warning flags up and down the organization that they were, specifically the 4 who wound up committing this crime were specifically talking very loudly to anyone who would listen about how they wanted to kill every Iraqi on a planet. They were demonstrably homicidal. And so I guess if there's a lesson that I hope that the Army learns is that even when you have constraints on manpower, if your soldiers are sending homicidal red flags, you probably should pay attention to them because they're red flags for a reason. And the broader question, I think the second part of the question, I think that right now the Army, there's an offensive going on in a place called Marja where they're in Afghanistan where they're very much trying to apply parts of the counterinsurgency theory that were very successful in Iraq to Afghanistan. They're the previous strategy would have been, because there's poppy fields which can be made into heroin, that the Americans would just burn the poppy fields to the ground. Now there's at least an acknowledgement that, morally right or wrong, those poppy fields provide income, and if you just burn them to the ground, those farmers are not going to have any income. So maybe in a transition period, you either pay them for their poppy and destroy the poppy, or you try to look the other way while maybe this crop or the next crop sort of gets away. The Army is very seriously talking about, looking the other way while criminal behavior is going on because they understand that income has to come in until they can transition to new crops. I think that's a mode of thinking when 5 years ago they just would have burned the fields to the ground. And farmers be damned, they should know that it was wrong to support the heroin trade, and they deserve what they get. And what they got was more insurgency. So I think that certain lessons of counterinsurgency that worked in Iraq are being tested now in Afghanistan, and it's open question how effective they're going to be in a different geography and a different populace.
Yes. Has the change of the chiefs of staff and secretaries of defense made any difference?
Absolutely. Yeah, no question. I think that, Rumsfeld and Casey changing to Gates and Petraeus and now Odierno has been a sea change. Yeah, no question.
Is the fact that the lieutenant colonel was promoted a thumb in the nose for the College of Cardinals, whatever it is? Yes, he's been taken out of a direct, however you call it, but he's the colonel.
Yes. Believe it or not, I mean, I don't know, I've covered a couple of murder trials before, and as perverse as this sounds, even murder trials, when you go to, you cover the trials and outside of the courtrooms and everybody's in the same town, and it creates this weird sort of community. So around the Bravo Company story, and I don't even mean that the book created it, but there's always been kind of a Bravo Company community that talks about issues having to do with Bravo and First to the 502nd. I don't know why Lieutenant Colonel Conk was promoted. I'm not in the military. I don't have the authority. All I can say is that there were a great many people in this very informal community who were surprised. And that's where I have to leave it, because I don't know more about it than that. But as people talk and analyze the deployment, there was very confident discussion among people who were in a position to know that I would never know that, well, he'll never be promoted. And then he was promoted, and I don't know why.
Questions?
You had said that these four gentlemen were well-known. Did other soldiers comment on their behavior prior? I missed the part of your presentation. Prior to their getting into the actual acts that got them...
Everybody knew about it. Stephen Green, in particular, was particularly vocal and particularly outspoken in his hatred of Iraqis. It wasn't just fellow soldiers. He told the brigade commander, who is a full-bird colonel, in a private counseling session that he had, that he wanted to kill every last Iraqi on the planet. And the brigade commander basically gave him a pat on the back and sent him out to battle and told his company commander, keep an eye on him. Perhaps more damning than that was Stephen Green had a combat stress counseling session with a lieutenant colonel who is a forensic psychiatric practitioner nurse with the authority to dispense drugs and the authority to make diagnoses. And he told her over a half-an-hour counseling session or longer about his intense hatred of Iraqis, about how much he wanted to kill Iraqis. Her intake sheet was entered into evidence at his murder trial, and 4 times on a single 8.5 by 11 sheet is the mention of killing Iraqi civilians. She diagnosed him with combat operational stress reaction, which is not even in the DSM-4, which is the Bible of psychiatric evaluations. Combat operational stress reaction is the Army, they don't even call it a diagnosis, they call it a description of normal reaction to abnormal events, which is combat. So in her medical opinion, COSR, combat operational stress reaction, he was having a normal reaction. So she gave him a small dose of, a small course of Seroquel, which is an antipsychotic, but in very low doses is actually more effective as a sleeping pill. And she sent him out to the front line. That was about 3 months before he committed quadruple homicide. So it wasn't just the lower down soldiers, it was officers too.
Question over here, and then one more after that over here.
Do you know if any of the people involved in the crime, if any of them had committed any crimes prior to this? Was that ever revealed to you?
Sure, yeah, misdemeanors. Stephen Green was found guilty of 3 juvenile misdemeanors. Again, the guy smoking cigarettes as a minor, drinking beer as a minor, and he was found with marijuana on him. Paul Cortez had gotten busted for marijuana a couple times while a soldier, which usually carries a monetary fine, and maybe they bust you a rank, and 30 days you're in the rank back. I mean, it's not an uncommon... Nothing major. No, nothing, and nothing violent. Well, James Barker had a history of spousal abuse, but not like that makes it... No violent crimes against strangers or... Yeah.
Do you think it's possible that in addition to the fact that this company suffered poor leadership, that they also had their share, more than their share of disciplinary problems and poor soldiers in addition to that. And do you think also that the Army could have avoided this by screening the soldiers a little better and having better educational requirements and psychological training and better training?
I'm going to contradict myself with both parts of the answer. Part one of the answer is I'm going to go back to there are no bad regiments, there are only bad colonels. I don't think in the broad statistical mapping of this platoon that this platoon got seated with, any worse number of bad apples than any other Army company. I think actually there are Stephen Greens walking around in the Army just as there are Stephen Greens walking around in society, but whatever force or coercion or power limitations are implied upon psychopaths that statistically must be walking around in our midst but are not committing crimes for whatever reason. I don't think that Bravo Company or 1st Platoon specifically was dealt a worse hand in terms of personnel. I just think they were an infantry platoon, just like every other infantry platoon. It was a random distribution of men. That being said, here's where I'm going to contradict myself. Stephen Green should not have been in the Army. I mean, he shouldn't have made it through. He got a moral waiver because you're not supposed to be allowed in the Army if you have a record of any type. But he had 3 misdemeanors. He got what's called a moral waiver, which is basically somebody signing a piece of paper saying it's okay that you committed these crimes. So if you will allow me that contradiction, I will say that, yeah, some of those guys should not have been in the Army.
Well, Jim, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I believe that you've been invited to speak to training officers at West Point.
That's true.
On the lessons of leadership, and we're really grateful that you've given us a bit of a preview of I imagine, what you may be saying to them.
Yes, that was the beginning.
I feel as though we've learned a lot from you tonight. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.